So now that we've taken a look at how the English kind of established them on the continent, let's take a look at these colonies as they develop. So let's take a look at the New England colonies first. So the New England colonies include Massachusetts, Connecticut, Rhode Island, and New Hampshire. Okay. The Pilgrims are kind of the first ones to show up in this area. And they had been dissenters, or people who strongly disagree with official policy in England. At this time, many of the people who disagreed with the beliefs of the Church of England, okay, and they wanted religious freedom. And they became what they call separatists, a person in the 16th and 17th centuries who wished to leave the Church of England. Pilgrims were one such group, okay? And not to get into a ton of detail, but essentially the Church of England was created under Henry VIII. He wanted to divorce his wife. The Pope wouldn't let him, so he essentially just said, fine, I'll create my own church, and I'm going to put myself in charge of it. And so that's kind of what the Church of England is, in a very, very, very watered-down way. Anyway, again, the Pilgrims are a group of separatists who want to leave the church. And they didn't approve of the church reforms. They believed in complete separation, and they believed it was the only way that they could continue on their spiritual journey. So in 1620, the Pilgrims boarded the Mayflower and were supposed to go to Virginia. They had a charter to go to Virginia. Well, the ship strayed off course and ends up landing on Cape Cod. And they had a lot of delays, and so they got started late, and they show up in the fall. And there's no time to grow food. They're not ready. There's not enough time to build adequate shelter, nothing. But anyway, before they even get off the ship, they realize that the contract or charter they had with the king, didn't apply to where they had landed. They knew they weren't in Virginia. So the white men on the ship signed a contract called the Mayflower Compact. And it was binding them to abide by their own laws and establish a civil society. It's really one of the first examples of a democratic document in the United States. But again, ill-prepared to start a colony in September of 1620. So the first winter, half of them die from illness and exposure. In the spring of 1621, they end up meeting some Native Americans, and these Native Americans help them grow their own food and show them how to fish and use, the fish as fertilizers and things like that. And this is what leads to what we now call the first Thanksgiving. Of course, we know that it's not what we think it is, right? At the same time, there's another separatist group called the Puritans, and they believed the Church of England needed reform. But the Puritans wanted to reform the church from within, not completely separate from it. So in 1630, they began migrating from England to Massachusetts Bay Colony. They believed that God was going to help them create a moral community, and John Winthrop, their leaders, the colony was going to be as a city upon a hill, the eyes of all people are upon us. So it was going to become the shining beacon for everybody to follow. They established what becomes the New England Way, which is a Puritan system of self-governance. The church was the center of the community. All citizens were required to attend the church. They believed that the congregation held authority and could punish members who disagreed with their beliefs. And there are some who do, right? So not all of them agree with this. 1636, Thomas Hooker and a group end up leaving Massachusetts to find a new colony in Connecticut. And they established this colony under the Fundamental Orders of Connecticut in 1639. Which is a founding document of the Connecticut colony. It listed 11 laws and stood as the framework for governing that colony. It established a General Assembly of Representatives, so, elected people who were going to go make decisions for their constituents. Church membership was also not a requirement for voting, as it was in the Massachusetts Bay Colony. 1631, we have another one who doesn't agree. And that's Roger Williams. He's a religious dissenter, and he's a Pilgrim minister who had arrived in Massachusetts Bay Colony and openly was attacking the laws requiring church attendance and taxes to the church. He ends up being banished or sent away as punishment, usually without hope of returning. And in 1636, he bought land from the Narragansett, which is a Native American tribe from the area, and ends up establishing the colony of Rhode Island. And Rhode Island is the first place in the New World, and I think the world, I'd have to double check, to establish the separation of church and state. 1630 is another dissenter, Anne Hutchinson, who was actually pregnant at the time, was banished for teaching that people didn't need to have these religious leaders to be able to have a personal relationship with God. They could pray to God themselves, not the church. And so she's banished, and she ends up finding a settlement within Rhode Island as well. So go ahead, pause, stop, watch the video. What was the Mayflower Compact, and why was it important? Why did some groups leave the Massachusetts Bay Colony to establish these new colonies? So the next person we're going to be introduced to is Squanto. Squanto is a Native American. He spoke fluent English. He's part a folk hero and part myth. He was a real man, but a lot of what we know about him is not supported by, research. It's mostly through hearsay. So he had actually been kidnapped in 1605 by Englishmen and taken to England. He'd been treated well, and he was taught English while he was there. And in 1615, he was supposedly returned to the colonies by John Smith, who's in Jamestown, to be an interpreter. However, he's kidnapped again, taken to Spain, was going to be sold into the slave trade. He ends up being able to escape, and in 1619, he sails with merchants to New England to help establish trade with the Native Americans who lived there. But when he returned, he found that his lands, when he returns to his lands, he finds that most of his Native American population, the Pawtuxet, had been wiped out by disease brought by the Europeans. In 1621, Samoset, who is another Native American, and actually the first Native American to greet those pilgrims, the one that we think of when we think about Thanksgiving, brought him to Plymouth Colony, and he helped negotiate peace treaties between pilgrims and Native Americans. Unfortunately, while leading an expedition around Cape Cod, he ends up dying of a fever, and his last words are, "Pray for me, Governor, that I might go to the Englishman's God in heaven." So before we move on from that, we have to keep in mind that this man who had been a Native American, this statement here, I think, shows how much he had really assimilated and grown to appreciate the English colonists. So go ahead, pause, take a moment to answer this question. How did Squanto help the pilgrims in Plymouth? So now the pilgrims have been in America for nearly 50 years, and even though things were I'm not going to say very good, they were stable in the beginning. There were definitely times that things were good, times things were bad, but tensions are growing. And most of this is because more and more settlers are coming here, they need more and more land, and to dissuade the Native Americans from attacking, the Plymouth government forces the Wampanoag to surrender their guns. And John Sassaman, who was a Native American who had converted to Christianity and was an interpreter for the colonists, had warned them of an impending attack by the Wampanoag, led by their leader Metacom. Shortly after, John Sassaman is found dead, and authorities, without any kind of evidence, arrest and hang 3 Wampanoag Native Americans. This rightfully angers the Native Americans, and Metacom and his troops end up attacking 52 towns in New England. They destroyed 12 of them completely. By the following summer, however, Metacom's troops are suffering from disease, hunger, and shortage of weapons. And so that aggression ends. And Metacom, to the colonists, becomes known as King Philip, and no one really knows why. But because the colonists begin calling him that, it becomes known as King Philip's War. 600 colonists and thousands of Native Americans die because of this war. At the same time that tensions are growing between the Native Americans and the colonists in New England, there's tensions growing between colonists in New England. In February 1692, in Salem, Massachusetts, authorities accused 3 women of witchcraft. And this is based on some village girls who were acting strangely. And people believed that witches existed and were living in Salem. And in England, witch trials had been happening for centuries. And there was actually a new book just published about how to hunt and find, witches. Nearly 200 women and men are accused throughout just a couple years here and brought to trial. Most of the time, the evidence were just accusations or hearsay and nothing else. 20 of them are actually put to death, mostly by hanging. There is one man, Giles Corey, who is actually crushed to death by stone. And what happens in Salem really highlights some underlying issues happening in the early colonial period. And one of those main issues are women owning property. It was not allowed. But when a man died, it went to his son. If there was no male heir, his wife or daughter could inherit it. And many of those that had been accused of being witches were women who had inherited property from their husbands or their fathers. And this definitely went against the societal norms, and it challenged gender roles in the colony. When the women were arrested, many times their land was actually confiscated and many times bought by their male neighbors, many of them who were the accusers of witchcraft for those women. Governor William Phipps and an influential minister named Increase Mather were very important and influential men in the colony. And they supported the witch trials at first, but then realized that things had really started to go too far. And by May of 1693, Phipps pardoned all those that were still imprisoned, and the courts dismissed charges and returned non-guilty verdicts for those that did make it to trial. So go ahead and pause and answer the following questions. Why did Metacom attack New England towns? And why were landowning women targets of witchcraft accusations?